The first time I heard the coffin lock click twice, I thought it was nothing more than the old house playing tricks on me. You live long enough in a place like this, a wooden frame built before the interstate cut through town, with pipes that moan and beams that shift, and you learn not to jump at every creak. But this was different. It wasn't wood sighing or a mouse scuttling through the walls. It was deliberate, metallic, sharp. A sound made with intention. Click, click. I froze where I stood, halfway down the hallway, barefoot on the cold oak floor. The air had that particular heaviness it sometimes gets right before a thunderstorm, even though the sky outside was clear. I held my breath and waited for it to happen again, praying it wouldn't. It didn't. Instead, silence rolled in thick, filling every corner of the house until I could hear the thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. This house was mine now, though it had never really felt like mine. It belonged to my grandmother first, then my mother, then eventually to me after the funeral no one wanted to hold. Inheriting it felt less like a gift and more like a sentence, but I didn't say that out loud to the relatives who handed me the keys and patted my back like they were sorry for me. The house came with all the trappings of family history, old photographs, porcelain dolls with chipped faces, a cedar chest of letters that smelled of mildew, and it came with the coffin. It sat in the back room, covered in a white sheet that never quite hid its shape. When I was a girl, I wasn't allowed in there. My grandmother said it was storage. Nothing important, but children know when they're being lied to. I'd sneak glances through the cracked doorway, watching dust motes float in the narrow shaft of light across that sheet. Even then, I could trace the outline beneath, the long rectangular box with iron handles and a heavy lock. Now, grown and alone, I had the key to the room, though I rarely used it. Some nights, when the wind howled through the broken vent in the attic, I would stand at the threshold and stare at that coffin until my skin crawled. It wasn't empty. I knew that much. The family story was that it held what was left of a distant relative from some epidemic. No one had said more. No one wanted to. Tonight, though, the sound came not from the house's bones, but from that very coffin. 2 clicks. Precise. Undeniable. I whispered into the still air like a fool. Hello? Nothing. Then, soft as breath, words formed. I didn't hear them with my ears so much as feel them, vibrating at the base of my skull. Don't open yet. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the hall rug. My mouth went dry. The sheet covering the coffin hadn't moved. The lock wasn't glowing or rattling. Everything looked exactly the same, as if I had imagined it all. But I hadn't. I couldn't have. Who warns me? I whispered, clutching the doorframe like it might keep me upright. The answer came quick, without hesitation, a voice muffled and aching, as though pushed through dirt. The one they swapped. He's inside with me. I slammed the door shut before I could think better of it. My hand shook as I turned the old brass knob until it clicked. My grandmother's words echoed from memory, words I'd never taken seriously until now. The dead don't always stay where you put them. I should have called someone right then. A friend, a priest. Hell, even the sheriff who still owed me a favor from high school. But what would I say? That a coffin in my house had just spoken to me? That a dead man claimed he wasn't alone? Number. I was already the strange woman who came back to town after a divorce, rattling around a too-big house with too many ghosts of her own. I wasn't about to hand them more reasons to whisper about me at the diner. Still, I couldn't ignore it. My body wouldn't let me. My heart hammered. My legs carried me to the kitchen in jerky steps. I poured a glass of water, my hands trembling so badly that half of it sloshed onto the counter. I told myself I'd dreamed it, that I was overtired, that grief had finally bent me out of shape. And then it happened again. From down the hall, faint but clear, click, click. This time, I didn't go back to check. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the water glass, willing myself not to cry. But in the stillness of the night, when the refrigerator hummed and the old clock ticked, I thought I heard something else. Faint, low, impossible. Two voices now whispering over each other, tangled and desperate. That was when I knew the coffin wasn't just an heirloom. It was a story unfinished, and somehow I was part of it. By morning, I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a hallucination. Sleep deprivation can do that. Divorce papers, late-night wine, the constant hum of loneliness. Your mind starts inventing company. That's what I told myself while brewing coffee so strong it tasted like burnt earth. But the lie didn't hold. Not after the second lock click in the night, and especially not after the words that followed. Don't open yet. And the answer to my question, still ricocheting through my skull like a bullet, the one they swapped. He's inside with me. I didn't imagine that. I couldn't have. The old house felt different that morning, heavier somehow. Sunlight strained through the curtains but never quite warmed the rooms. Dust clung in the air like it had no intention of settling. Even the kettle took longer than usual to boil, hissing and sputtering as though protesting. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the hallway. The door to that back room was closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing behind it, listening. Growing up, I'd been told not to play near that room. "It's just storage," my grandmother would snap, pushing me toward the porch where she could watch me from her rocking chair. But children know when adults are lying, and I'd heard things even then. Scratches sometimes, a low thud, a sound like air being forced through narrow cracks. I asked once what was inside. She told me in her dry, brittle way, "History, child." And history is nothing but trouble if you wake it up. I thought it was superstition, just a way to keep me from snooping. But last night, the coffin itself spoke. That wasn't a child's imagination. That wasn't superstition. I tried to piece the words together logically, the one they swapped. Swapped with who and why? Burials in this town had always carried whispers, stories of epidemics when coffins ran out, when families bartered for bodies to fill plots, when paperwork got misfiled. The kind of things no one wanted on record, but everyone hinted at over beers. But what did that have to do with my family's house, with that locked coffin? The coffee turned cold before I remembered to drink it. My hands were restless, fidgeting with the chipped ceramic mug, tapping against the table, tracing old grooves in the wood. Anything to avoid the hallway. Finally, I couldn't stand the waiting. I got up, barefoot on the boards, each step a drumbeat in my chest. I stood in front of the closed door, my palm flat against the cool wood. "I heard you," I whispered. "Say it again." Nothing. The silence pressed back, thick and absolute. Then faintly, the lock rattled. One quick shiver of metal against metal, my breath caught. And then the voice. Not loud, not even clear, more like the vibration of thought, an echo that my body registered before my ears could. "You shouldn't be here." I jerked my hand away like the wood had burned me. My knees nearly gave out, and I backed into the opposite wall. "You shouldn't be here," it repeated. But this time the tone shifted, layered, as if more than one speaker overlapped. I swore I heard another voice beneath the first, fainter but urgent, a man and something else tangled together. "I live here," I said, my voice unsteady. "This is my house." Silence, then sharp as broken glass. "Not yours. Never yours." My throat went dry. I wanted to run out the front door, drive until the highway swallowed me, keep going until gas money or sanity ran out. But instead, I slid down the hallway wall and sat there, trembling like a child. For a moment, I thought about calling my mother. She'd know what to say, even if her advice was half whiskey and half scripture. But I remembered the hospital bed, her hands thin as paper, the way she'd gripped mine and said, "Some things don't need fixing, sweetheart." Just locking away, maybe she'd known what lived inside that coffin all along. I stayed there until my legs stopped shaking. The voices didn't return, but the lock glinted in the dim light like an eye watching me. I swore I could feel it waiting, patient, like it had all the time in the world. That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a haunting. I was tangled in something older, something woven through my family, and whatever swapped meant, I was next in line to carry its weight. By the third night, I stopped pretending it was all in my head. I'd tried the normal tricks, leaving the TV running in the living room, filling the house with noise, pretending that a laugh track from some sitcom could drown out something clawing its way through wood. But when the clock struck midnight and the air turned still as stone, the coffin announced itself again. The sound was sharper this time, not just a click, a rattle. The lock clanged against the latch like someone inside had gripped it with furious hands and shaken until metal bit back. I jolted upright on the sofa, blankets sliding off my shoulders, pulse hammering in my neck. My first thought was intruder. My second, more dangerous thought, open it and see. I crept down the hall, the flashlight on my phone cutting a weak cone through the dark. The door to the back room loomed ahead, closed but trembling. I swear I saw the knob twitch. For one stupid second, I considered turning it. Instead, I pressed my ear to the wood. The rattle had stopped, but the air on the other side felt alive, humming as if the room itself had a pulse. Then came the voices. Not one, two. Low at first, like water through pipes, then sharper, layered, carrying edges of desperation and rage. They weren't clear words, but I could catch fragments, swapped, buried. Not mine. Then silence. Then both voices at once, colliding so hard I had to jerk my head back. I stumbled, bracing against the hallway wall, gasping like I'd run miles. I wanted to scream, wanted to fling the door open, drag that coffin out into the yard, smash it with an axe until nothing was left but splinters. But I stayed frozen, because deep down, I knew. If I opened that coffin before it was ready, before whatever was in there wanted me to, I'd regret it more than anything I'd ever done. The flashlight beam skimmed across the wall, catching the framed photograph of my grandmother on her wedding day. Her stern eyes seemed to follow me, mouth set in that tight line I remembered so well. She'd always kept secrets, that woman, kept them like treasures, buried deep where no one could pry them loose. "Don't open yet," the voice had said. Yet. That single word hooked in me like a barb. If I wasn't meant to open it now, was I meant to open it later? Who decided that? Them? Me? Or was this all some twisted inheritance? A family debt I hadn't agreed to but would have to pay anyway? My chest felt tight. I slid down until I was crouched on the floor, back against the plaster, the cold seeping into my skin. And there, in the half-light, I remembered something I'd buried for years. I was maybe 8 years old the night I first heard voices in this house. My mother had been out late, waitressing, and my grandmother had tucked me into the lumpy spare bed. I woke hours later to muffled arguing drifting down the hall. I crept toward the sound, and from the cracked door of this very room, I heard her speaking to someone, whispering, coaxing, hushing. Another voice answered, low and raw, but I never saw who it belonged to. When she noticed me in the doorway, she slammed it shut and slapped me so hard I tasted blood. "Stay out of there," she hissed, her face paler than I'd ever seen it. Now, decades later, the memory slid back into place, sharp and undeniable. She hadn't been alone that night. She'd been talking to the coffin. The lock rattled again, harder this time, as if responding to the thought. The sound reverberated down the hallway, shaking loose dust from the crown molding. I bolted to the kitchen and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, the old iron skillet my mother used to fry chicken on Sundays. My hands shook as I lifted it, like I could actually defend myself from... What? A ghost? A corpse? Something older than both? Standing there, skillet raised, I realized the truth that cut deeper than fear. This wasn't just haunting. This was bloodline, and it wasn't letting me walk away. By dawn, the house was silent again. Silent, but not still. It's hard to explain unless you've lived with something that isn't supposed to be there. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the hush of something waiting. I sat at the kitchen table with the skillet still within arm's reach, my palms raw from gripping its handle all night. The coffee pot was empty. The air tasted stale, as though the house itself had been holding its breath with me. Every instinct told me to leave. Just get in the car and drive until this place was a shrinking dot in the rearview mirror. But the thought knotted in my gut. Leave and what? Start over again? I'd already tried that after the divorce. Moved out to the city, tried office jobs, dated men who looked at me with bored eyes and said the right words but never meant them. I'd failed at running before. And besides, leaving this house felt like abandoning something unfinished. So I stayed. By mid-morning, the memories started pressing in. Things I hadn't thought about in years. When I was little, my grandmother would take me for walks to the cemetery on the edge of town. She'd bring fresh flowers and leave them on certain graves without explaining who they belonged to. Old friends, she'd say, though she never once spoke their names. I'd trail behind her, counting the rows of crooked stones, tracing the dates with my fingers. Many of them were from the same 2 years, 1918 and 1920, the influenza years, dozens of lives swallowed in weeks. The town had run out of coffins back then. I'd overheard the old men at the diner tell it like a ghost story, how bodies were swapped around, coffins filled with sandbags to make up the weight, graves dug in haste. They just needed the ground to look full, one had said, stirring his coffee with a shaky hand. Didn't matter who was in what box. And here I was, living in a house with a coffin no one talked about. The shame burned hot in my chest. I'd skipped my grandmother's funeral because I couldn't face her, not after the years of silence between us. We'd fought over the inheritance, over the bakery she wanted me to run, over the way I lived my life. She said I carried weakness like a badge. I said she carried secrets like armor. We never forgave each other. And when she died, I let them put her in the ground without me. Now, sitting in her kitchen, her coffin rattling just a few doors down, I wondered if she'd been trying to warn me all along. The lock had clicked like a metronome marking time. Don't open yet. Not never. Yet. I wanted to scream at the empty air. Tell me when. Tell me why. Instead, I opened her cedar chest, the one I'd avoided since moving back. The smell of mothballs and mildew hit hard enough to sting my nose. Inside were letters bundled with frayed ribbon, old photographs curling at the edges, and a leather-bound journal. Her handwriting crawled across the pages in the same sharp script she used on grocery lists and birthday cards. Most entries were mundane: weather notes, pie recipes, muttered complaints about neighbors. But then, buried between them, a line that froze me. He's not where he belongs. We traded to keep him close. I read it 3 times, certain I'd misinterpreted. My hands shook so badly I almost tore the page out. The words weren't dated, but the ink had faded more than the others, like she'd tried to scrub them clean with time. Traded. Was that what the voice meant by swapped? My grandmother had been part of it. She'd kept someone in that coffin, someone who wasn't meant to be there. The shame deepened into something sharper, fear tangled with guilt. Maybe I wasn't just inheriting her house, maybe I was inheriting her sins. By evening, I sat on the porch steps, watching the cicadas rise from the trees, their shrill chorus thick in the humid air. Across the street, Mr. Carson was mowing his lawn, his shirt damp with sweat, his face calm as ever. Ordinary life moved on, blind to what was happening in my hallway. I envied him. The coffin's lock hadn't rattled all day, but I could feel it waiting like a storm cloud that doesn't move, just hangs heavy, daring you to believe the sky will hold. And I knew, sooner or later, it would speak again. And when it did, I might not be strong enough to keep the lid closed. That night, I couldn't avoid it any longer. The house didn't give me the option. I tried to make it through with normal distractions. Scrubbed the counters until my knuckles were raw, flipped through old recipe books, even turned on the radio to catch a late-night ball game. But nothing landed. The silence between innings, the static between stations, it all felt like background, noise to something louder, something waiting just down the hall. By midnight, I was pacing. My breath came shallow. I told myself it was ridiculous, a grown woman circling her own kitchen like a child too scared to check the closet. And yet every step seemed to funnel me back toward that door. Finally, I gave in. The back hallway was darker than it should have been, the overhead bulb flickering like it had second thoughts. I carried a candle in one hand. Stupid, maybe, but I wanted something warm, something alive against the chill that seeped from that room. The door groaned when I pushed it open. The coffin sat there under its white sheet, familiar and yet utterly foreign, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. The candlelight stretched across its surface, catching the dull glint of the lock. I stepped closer. My bare feet whispered across the dusty floorboards, each one louder than the last. The air smelled of cedar and iron, with a faint undercurrent of something earthier. Soil, damp and sour, the way the cemetery smelled after rain. I set the candle on a side table, its flame jittering in the draft. My hand hovered over the sheet, fingertips trembling inches above the fabric. I had the sudden childish urge to pull the sheet off in one violent motion, like tearing off a bandage, but I didn't. Instead, I let my hand drop, flattening against the wood beneath. The coffin was cold, too cold for something that had been sitting in this house for decades. A shiver crawled up my arm and settled between my shoulders. And then it moved. Not much. Just a tremor. The faintest vibration beneath my palm, like something inside had shifted. I snatched my hand back, clutching it to my chest. My breath came fast and shallow. For a long minute, I just stood there, willing myself to leave. But curiosity gnawed harder than fear. I crouched, staring at the lock. It was an old iron piece, blackened with age, the kind you couldn't buy anymore unless you scoured antique shops. The kind meant to keep things shut. My grandmother had always been meticulous about locks, doors, chests, diaries, always locking, never opening. I reached out, wrapped my fingers around the lock, and gave the slightest twist. Click. The sound shot through me like electricity. Not the same deliberate click I'd heard in the night, but my own doing. Still, it rattled me. "Don't," a voice hissed. I froze, heart leaping into my throat. It hadn't come from outside the room. It hadn't even come from inside the coffin. It came from everywhere, all at once, vibrating through the floorboards, the walls, my own chest. Not yet. I stumbled back, knocking into the side table. The candle wobbled, spilling wax down its side, the flame shrinking, then flaring again. My knees buckled, and I dropped into a crouch, arms wrapped around myself like I could shield my body from something I couldn't see. The coffin rattled once, just once, a single sharp shudder, and then stillness. I pressed a shaking hand to my mouth to keep from sobbing. Tears stung my eyes anyway, blurring the edges of the room. "You know my name," I whispered, though I didn't mean to speak. The words slipped out like confession. A pause, then the faintest murmur, "Always." I scrambled to my feet, nearly knocking the candle over again, and fled the room. The slam of the door behind me echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Back in the kitchen, I collapsed into a chair, hugging my arms tight. My skin still crawled where the coffin had trembled beneath my hand. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it all: stress, grief, too much late-night coffee. But I couldn't, because in the back of my mind, under all the fear, a single truth gnawed. If I'd pulled just a little harder, if I'd turned that lock one click further, I would have seen what waited inside. and part of me wasn't sure if I'd regret not doing it or regret that one day I would. Sleep didn't come easy after that night. When it did, it dragged me under like a riptide. No gentle drifting, no comfort, just sudden darkness and the sense that I was being pulled somewhere I didn't want to go. I dreamed of earth, damp, heavy, pressing against my chest. I clawed upward, but every handful slipped back down, choking me. Above, a coffin lid loomed inches from my face, its underside rough with splinters. When I screamed, no sound escaped. Only soil filled my mouth. I woke, gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. For a moment, I thought the dream had followed me. The room was darker than it should have been, as if the shadows themselves had thickened. My bedside lamp flickered once and died, and that's when I heard it. The scrape. Not the click this time, not the rattle. A scrape, long and steady, like wood dragging against wood. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my phone, flicked on the flashlight, and crept barefoot to the hall. The back room door was ajar, just a sliver, but wide enough to notice. I knew I'd slammed it shut. The candle I'd left inside had guttered out, leaving only the pale cone of my phone's light. The coffin sat where it always had, white sheet draped like a shroud. But something was off. I squinted. The sheet didn't fall evenly anymore. One corner had slid down, revealing polished wood beneath. And worse, the coffin itself was shifted. Only an inch, maybe two, but forward closer to the door. It had moved. I stepped back, the floor groaning beneath me, every instinct in my body screaming to run. But another feeling tugged harder. Recognition. Not of the coffin, but of the emptiness it mirrored. Since the divorce, the house had felt like a tomb anyway. Just me and the echo of a life that hadn't panned out the way I thought it would. I'd pretended I didn't care, laughed it off with coworkers, brushed away pity with a joke. But lying awake night after night, I'd felt that same weight pressing on me. Not earth, but silence. Not splinters, but loneliness. And now, here was this coffin, dragging itself closer, like it knew, like it understood what it meant to be trapped. I tightened my grip on the phone. My voice came out rough, half a whisper, half a plea. "What do you want from me?" The answer was almost gentle. To be seen. I swayed where I stood. My stomach turned cold. For years, I'd buried myself in routine. Clock in, clock out, heat leftovers, sleep. Pretend that counted as living. And now, a voice from a coffin was echoing the very thing I hadn't admitted aloud. "Why me?" I asked. Silence stretched. So long I thought I'd imagined the reply. Then, barely audible, "Because you're already halfway under." I slammed the door again, heart racing so fast I could taste metal. I wedged a chair under the knob, though some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. Back in my bedroom, I curled into a ball, every light turned on. I stared at the ceiling, trying not to blink, trying not to hear the faint drag of wood against wood that seemed to echo still in my ears. The rational part of me wanted to explain it away. Houses settle. Dreams bleed into waking. Stress manifests in strange ways. I repeated those excuses like a prayer, but none stuck, because deep down I knew the truth. The coffin wasn't staying put anymore, and neither was I. The knock startled me so bad I nearly dropped the skillet. Morning light had just begun to seep through the curtains, weak and watery, and I hadn't slept more than a handful of hours. My nerves were frayed, skin buzzing like I'd drunk a pot of coffee on an empty stomach. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I wiped my palms on my jeans and cracked the front door. It was Sheriff Dalton, though he hadn't worn the badge in over 15 years. He'd gone gray around the edges, belly softened with age, but his eyes were still sharp as the day he caught me sneaking beers behind the football bleachers. "Morning, Marin," he said, tipping his cap. "Figured I'd check in." Been a while, I forced a smile, even though my heart was still sprinting from the sound of his knuckles on wood. You picked a fine hour to do it." "Didn't think you'd mind," he said. "Your porch light was on all night." I swallowed. I hadn't realized. He glanced past me into the hallway where shadows clung a little too thick, a little too stubborn. "Everything all right?" I wanted to say yes. To laugh it off, tell him the light was just habit, that I was fine. That's what people in this town did. Polished their mess until it looked like something worth putting in the church bulletin. But the lie caught in my throat. "I've been hearing things," I admitted. Dalton raised a brow. "Mice?" "Locks," I said, quieter, like something trying to get out. He leaned on the porch railing, chewing over my words like a man who'd heard too many confessions in his life. "You know folks around here talk. Always. Have about your grandmother. About that back room I stiffened." "What about it?" He shrugged, but his eyes stayed on mine. "That she kept something she shouldn't have. That she was mixed up in the old swap business when the influenza hit." The word hit me hard. Swap. The very word that had seeped through the coffin's wood. Dalton sighed, the sound tired. "Look, Marin, I don't put stock in ghost stories, but I've seen what secrets do to families. Eat 'em alive from the inside out." I crossed my arms, partly to shield myself, partly to keep from shaking. "So, what do you suggest, Sheriff? That I pack up and run?" His gaze softened. "I'm suggesting you don't go prying at something that's been shut tight this long. If your grandma locked it away, maybe she had a damn good reason." I almost laughed. "That's easy to say when it isn't rattling your walls." For a moment, the old lawman's mask slipped, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not disbelief, but recognition. Like maybe he'd heard the rattle too, years back, when he came by on official business and lingered too long near the wrong door. He straightened, tugging his cap lower. "You keep your lights on. You get yourself a dog. Noise helps, makes the house feel less empty." Then he tipped his head and walked back down the steps, boots crunching against gravel. Just like that, normal life resumed. I shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling hard. The silence swelled in his absence. Too big, too heavy. I thought about what he'd said. Eat you alive from the inside out. Maybe that's what was happening. Maybe this house wasn't haunted by something buried in a coffin. Maybe it was haunted by me, my regrets, my shame, my grandmother's secrets festering until they found a voice. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, the air shifted again. A low vibration shivered through the hallway, subtle but unmistakable. I turned slowly, my eyes drawn like a magnet toward the back room. The chair I'd jammed under the knob was lying on its side. The door was open, not wide, just enough. Enough to let me know the coffin hadn't listened to Dalton's advice any more than I had. The moment I saw the door cracked open, my breath caught. I knew I hadn't touched it since the night I wedged the chair beneath the knob. The thought of someone else in my house, an intruder, should have been my first terror. But it wasn't. My fear was simpler, colder, that the coffin itself had wanted out. I stood frozen at the threshold of the hallway, my hand still pressed to the front door as if I could choose to leave instead. Walk out, slam it behind me, let sunlight and distance fix what darkness had broken. But my feet didn't move. They never did when it came to this house. Something always pulled me deeper in. I walked the hall, slow, each board creaking under my bare feet. My grandmother's photographs lined the wall, stiff, black and white portraits, sharp-eyed ancestors who looked down at me like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. None of them smiled, not one. The door gave way with the gentlest push of my fingertips. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the house, sharp and damp like earth after rain. The sheet had slid nearly halfway off the coffin now, pooled on the floor like it had been tugged. I told myself to stop, to call Dalton, to lock the door and hammer boards across the frame, but I kept moving forward, candle in one hand, the other reaching for the coffin as though magnetized. The wood gleamed where the sheet no longer covered it, polished but dulled by dust. The iron lock sat heavy, blackened with age. I touched it. The metal burned cold against my fingers, colder than ice. "Don't," the voice whispered. I jerked, nearly dropping the candle. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. Just me and the coffin, and the hum in my bones that said I wasn't alone. My hand lingered on the lock anyway. Click. I turned it just one notch. The sound reverberated like thunder. The coffin shuddered beneath my palm, not violently, more like a breath, like something shifting within. The voice came again, but this time there were two, layered over one another, so close I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Not ready?" My chest seized. "Then why call to me?" I whispered, my lips trembling. Silence, then muffled but clear, as if spoken through a wall of soil. "Because you can hear." The room swam. My knees felt weak. I gripped the coffin tighter to steady myself, but the wood thrummed beneath my hand, vibrating with life that shouldn't be there. I inhaled through my teeth, bracing myself, and pulled. The lid lifted just enough to break the seal of dust. A faint hiss escaped, like air rushing out of a long-sealed jar. The smell hit me hard, damp earth, rusted metal, and something sweeter, almost like lilacs left too long in water, rot but perfumed. My candle flame bent sideways in the draft, and for a split second I saw inside. Not emptiness, not bones, a face, but distorted, blurred, as though pressed through glass or water. The features didn't line up. Nose bleeding into cheekbone, eyes too wide, mouth twisted in a silent scream. And behind it, another. A second face overlapping the first, mouths open as if arguing in a language I couldn't understand. The sight knocked me backward. The lid slipped from my hands, slamming shut with a hollow finality that rattled the window panes. The candle toppled, wax splattering across the floor, but the flame somehow held. I scrambled back, my shoulders striking the wall. My lungs dragged for air like I'd been buried alive. From inside the coffin, the voices rose, tangled together. "Don't open yet, already too late." The contradictions rang through me like clashing bells. My stomach lurched, bile burning my throat. I staggered to my feet and bolted, slamming the door behind me so hard the frame shook. Back in the kitchen, I collapsed into a chair, trembling head to toe. My hands were streaked with dust, my clothes carrying that sickly, sweet perfume of decay. I scrubbed them with dish soap until my skin reddened, but the smell clung. I stared at my raw palms and whispered to myself, over and over, I saw them. I saw them. And in the silence that followed, I understood a truth that settled like lead in my chest. Whatever my grandmother had locked away, it wasn't just one body. It wasn't just one soul. It was two. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out of something that wasn't rest, twitching awake every time the pipes groaned or the wind shifted. My body begged for oblivion, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces overlapping, blurred into one another like oil on water. By morning, the house smelled faintly of lilacs. I scrubbed the counters, washed the floors, even opened every window to drag in the cool September air. Still, the scent clung. A ghostly sweetness, heavy and cloying, settling on my tongue until I gagged. I told myself I wouldn't go back into that room, that I'd lock it, hammer the frame shut, maybe even move into a motel for a while. But by noon, I was standing in front of the door again, hand pressed flat against the wood. The voices came quicker this time. They didn't wait for night. "Who are you?" I whispered. A pause, then two responses overlapping. "The one they buried. The one they stole." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" The lock rattled once. Not violent, just enough to punctuate the words that followed. "They swapped me." put me here." The voice fractured, one becoming two, then sliding back together, like a badly tuned radio. I pressed my forehead to the door. My grandmother's journal page burned in my memory. He's not where he belongs. We traded to keep him close. "You're saying—" My throat tightened. "You're saying you weren't supposed to be in that coffin?" "No," the voices said. "Yes," the voices said. They spoke together, contradicting, weaving over each other until I couldn't tell which truth belonged to which mouth. My stomach twisted. The old town rumors of the influenza years came rushing back. The shortages, the makeshift burials, the whispered word swaps, people buried in the wrong boxes, families tricked, records falsified, and my grandmother. My grandmother had been part of it. The realization came like a slap. She'd always claimed her faith was unshakable, that she kept our family's name clean when others cut corners, but she'd lied. She'd been part of whatever bargain left that coffin in her house, rattling decades later. "Why keep you here?" I asked, voice shaking. A long pause, then clear as day. "Because she loved me." The words sank deep, heavier than stone. My grandmother had loved someone enough to break the rules of death itself, to steal a body, to swap it with another. But who? The answer came not from the coffin, but from memory. I was 10 the first time I saw my grandmother cry. She was holding a photograph in her lap, edges worn soft, the image so faded I could barely make out the man's face. She'd pressed her thumb to his cheek and whispered a name I couldn't catch. When she noticed me, she tucked the photo away, wiped her eyes, and hissed, "Forget what you saw." I'd forgotten, or I'd tried to. But now the pieces clicked in place. That coffin wasn't just a secret. It was her shrine, her rebellion against death, and in doing it, she'd trapped more than one soul. I staggered back from the door, bile rising in my throat. The house suddenly felt smaller, its walls leaning in. Generations of silence pressed down like weight. From inside, the voices rose again, angry now, overlapping, pulling in opposite directions. She kept me. She buried me. She lied. She saved. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The words weren't entering through sound. They were inside me already, writhing in the marrow of my bones. "Stop!" I shouted. "Please!" The house stilled. My own breathing filled the quiet. Then one last whisper, softer than all the rest. "She left it for you." My blood went cold. For me, the coffin wasn't just my inheritance. It was my responsibility. My grandmother had passed it down, knowing it wasn't finished, knowing someone would have to face what she'd locked away. And now, like it or not, that someone was me. By the next week, the coffin stopped waiting for night. The rattles came at odd hours, while I was folding laundry, while I was on the porch shelling peas, even once in the middle of a phone call with my cousin in Nashville. I'd been forcing a laugh at some half-hearted joke about dating again when the clanging started in the back room, loud, insistent, like iron striking iron. I hung up mid-sentence and sat frozen at the kitchen table, praying she hadn't heard it through the line. But I knew better. It wasn't just me anymore. On Wednesday, Mrs. Carson from across the street waved me down as I pulled weeds from the garden. "You all right, Maren?" she asked, her voice too casual to be casual. "Only, folks been saying they hear noises coming from your place at night." Her husband mowed the lawn behind her, pretending not to listen. "What kind of noises?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. She hesitated. "Like someone pounding. Or shouting. Echoes, maybe. I told them it's just this old house settling, but—" She lowered her voice. "It don't sound like settling." I forced a smile, dirt clinging to my nails. "Old houses make old sounds. You know how it is." But her eyes lingered too long, searching before she finally nodded and walked off. That night, I dreamt of voices rising in chorus. Not just two anymore, but dozens. The whole town screaming from beneath the earth, clawing at their coffins. I woke drenched in sweat, lungs heaving like I'd been running. The sheets smelled of soil. The next day I climbed into the attic, desperate to find answers among the dust. The air was hot and dry, stifling, thick with moth wings. Boxes towered against the eaves, labeled in my grandmother's sharp hand, receipts, taxes, church records. But tucked in the far corner was one box unmarked. Inside were town ledgers, burial records yellowed and brittle, pages upon pages of names, dates, and plot numbers, some struck through, others scribbled over, and then folded into the back, a smaller sheet. My grandmother's writing again. Swapped. Whitlow for Carter. September 1919. No one will notice. Safer this way. My pulse thudded in my ears. I flipped through more papers, more swaps. Families I knew, names still carried by neighbors. Carter Whitlow, Jensen, Ramirez. She hadn't just done it once. She'd done it over and over. A sudden creak behind me made me whip around, heart pounding. Nothing there, only the attic window rattling in the breeze. But I knew better. Back downstairs, the voices started before I'd even set the records on the table. You found it. We told you. The words vibrated through the walls, through my skin, until I felt sick. What do you want from me? I snapped, slamming my palms against the kitchen table hard enough to scatter dust. The reply came from everywhere at once. Finish what she began. My chest clenched. What does that mean? The lock in the back room clanged louder than ever, like a hammer striking steel. I fled to the porch, desperate for air. Across the street, Mrs. Carson had stopped mowing. She was staring openly now, phone in hand, whispering to her husband. A few houses down, I caught the flicker of curtains moving, neighbors peering out like they were waiting for sirens. The shame burned hotter than the fear. This wasn't a secret anymore. My grandmother's sins, my house's curse. They were seeping into the neighborhood. The cicadas screamed in the trees. My throat closed. Back inside, I stared at the ledgers spread across the table. Names of the dead stared back at me, silent witnesses, and beneath them, my grandmother's careful scrawl, every swap accounted for. The coffin rattled again, a steady drumbeat now, boom, 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 like a fist against my ribcage, and for the first time, I wondered if it wasn't trying to get out. Maybe it was trying to bring me in. The storm rolled in just past midnight, thick clouds pressing low over the town. Rain lashed the windows, rattling the old panes like a hand desperate to get in. Thunder shook the floorboards beneath my feet, but even the storm couldn't drown out the sound from the back room. The coffin wasn't rattling anymore. It was pounding. Boom, boom, boom. Each strike landed in rhythm with the thunder, until I couldn't tell where the storm ended and the house began. I stood in the hall barefoot, the hem of my nightgown clinging damp against my legs, my fists clenched at my sides. Days of dread had coiled into a knot in my chest, and now it snapped. I was done running, done pretending, done swallowing my fear like medicine that never healed. I kicked the chair away from the door. My hand shook on the knob, but I turned it anyway. The door slammed open on its own, hitting the wall with a crack. The coffin had shifted all the way to the center of the room, the white sheet crumpled beneath it like discarded skin. The iron lock quivered, rattling in place as if struck by invisible hands. The voices rose in unison, louder than ever, overlapping until the words split apart and tangled back together again. Open me. Keep me shut. Save us. Bury us. I stepped forward, my heart hammering, my skin crawling with the wrongness of it all. Lightning flashed through the window, painting the room in white fire. For a moment I saw them, the blurred faces beneath the lid, mouths open in opposing screams. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice raw. "Tell me the truth!" The thunder swallowed the words, but the coffin answered anyway. She swapped me. She trapped me. She loved me. She lied. The voices tore at each other, each syllable a jagged blade. My ears rang, my skull splitting under the pressure of it. I dropped to my knees, hands clamped over my head, but it didn't help. And then, with a deafening crack, the lock snapped. The lid burst upward, slamming against the wall. Wind roared through the room, though the windows were shut, carrying the smell of damp earth and rotting flowers. My candle blew out, plunging everything into storm-lit darkness. 2 figures rose from the coffin, not whole, not separate, tangled together like reflections on broken glass. A man's face, gaunt and hollow-eyed. A woman's face, softer, but twisted with grief. They flickered in and out of each other, merging, splitting, screaming in voices that weren't meant to share the same air. I pressed back against the wall, my nails digging into the plaster. "Who are you?" I begged. The man's mouth opened, words dragged up like stone from a well. "Whitlow." The woman's voice followed, echoing over his, "Carter." Names, from the ledgers, from the swaps. "You weren't meant for each other," I whispered. The storm rattled the windows so hard I thought the glass would shatter. The 2 figures writhed, struggling against one another, their voices a cacophony. My grave. Her love. My body. Her theft. Lightning split the sky, illuminating them fully for the first time. I saw what my grandmother had done. Kept one soul from leaving, tied it to another by mistake or by cruelty. She hadn't preserved a lover. She'd created a prison, and now it was mine to witness. Tears burned my eyes, but my voice steadied. "She's gone. She can't keep you here anymore." The figures stilled. For the first time, silence filled the room. The man turned hollow eyes toward me. The woman's mouth trembled. "You can," they said together. The air went cold, heavy, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. Their gazes bored into me, demanding, pleading, condemning. My grandmother had passed the lock to me, and now the choice was mine. Do I free them or seal them again? The coffin lid slammed down of its own accord, the iron lock snapping shut with a final click. The voices fell silent. The storm outside eased to a drizzle, and I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my lungs dragging for air like I'd just surfaced from drowning. I didn't know if I had chosen or if they had chosen for me. All I knew was the coffin was shut again. For now. The house was quiet when the storm moved on. Not peaceful quiet, never that, but hollow, like the air after a scream. I lay on the floor of the back room until the trembling in my limbs dulled into a heavy ache. My breath rasped in and out, shallow, each inhale catching on the memory of what I'd seen. Faces overlapping, voices clashing, bodies stolen and trapped together by love twisted into possession. When I finally pushed myself upright, the coffin sat as if it had never moved. The sheet lay half pulled across it, dusted with plaster flakes shaken loose from the ceiling. The iron lock looked whole again, black and unmoving, like it hadn't just burst open. But I knew better. The silence pressed against me, heavy and watchful. I staggered to the kitchen and poured water into a chipped glass. My hands shook so badly I spilled half of it on the counter, but I forced the rest down, cold and metallic against my tongue. My reflection in the dark window startled me. Eyes wide, hair plastered to my damp forehead, mouth a thin white line. I looked less like myself and more like one of the old photographs upstairs, hollow-eyed, sharp with secrets. The neighbors had noticed the storm's violence, but they wouldn't know what had torn through my walls. They'd write off the flickering lights and the low rumble as thunder, and if they heard my screams, they'd chalk it up to nerves, to grief, to being that woman alone in her grandmother's place. Let them. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. The ledgers were still spread across the table, names bleeding through brittle paper. Whitlow. Carter. My grandmother's careful notes marking swaps like they were nothing more than errands checked off a list. She hadn't just broken the rules of burial. She'd broken the line between worlds, and she'd left the mess for me. The voices had said it plainly. You can. I thought of my grandmother sitting at this very table, hands steady even in old age, spooning sugar into her coffee while the coffin rattled down the hall. Did she grow used to it? Did she hear the voices too, day after day, and simply decide to bear it? Or did she believe she was protecting someone? Herself? Our family? The man whose name she whispered into a faded photograph? I pressed my palms flat to the table, grounding myself in the grain of the wood. "I'm not her," I said aloud, though no one was there to hear. The house disagreed. A faint scrape echoed from the back room, soft as a fingernail across stone. My throat tightened. I could board the door, move away, let the house rot into its own silence. But the truth was tangled too deep now. I'd seen them, heard them, touched the lock myself. I couldn't pretend ignorance anymore, and I couldn't deny the sharp thread of recognition that had pierced me when they said I could. Not must, not will. Could, as though the choice had always been mine, waiting, just like the house itself. I stepped onto the porch as dawn bled across the sky. The storm clouds thinned to streaks of gray and rose. Across the street, Mrs. Carson was already out with her coffee, pretending not to watch my house too closely. I raised a hand in a half wave, but she didn't wave back. The air smelled cleaner outside, rain-washed, but beneath it lingered that sweetness again. Lilacs. Always lilacs. I sat on the porch step, head in my hands, and let the weight of it sink. The coffin was shut. The voices were quiet. For now. But quiet doesn't mean gone. Quiet means waiting. And I understood, with a clarity that made my stomach twist. The lock had clicked closed again, but not by my hand. Whatever had claimed this house, whatever bargain my grandmother had struck, it wasn't finished. The dead don't always stay where you put them, and neither, I thought, do the living. I told myself I wouldn't go back into the back room again. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. I'd shut the door, pulled the sheet back over the coffin, and walked away as though that act alone could bury what I'd seen. But the house doesn't care about my decisions. For 3 days, it stayed still. I went through the motions. Washed dishes, swept floors, even drove into town to buy groceries just to see faces that didn't look like mine. People smiled, asked how I was settling back in. I lied easily. "Oh, just getting used to the old place again." No one pressed. They never do in towns like this. At night, though, the silence stretched too wide. I left the TV on, let infomercials drone until sunrise. Still, every sound carried weight. The settling boards, the hiss of wind through the vent. My pulse leapt at each one, waiting for the rattle. By the third night, I started to believe it might truly be over. That maybe I'd faced what my grandmother hadn't, and the coffin had sealed itself for good. That maybe the voices had finally found rest. I almost let myself believe it. Then, just before dawn, I woke to the sound of metal shifting. Click. A pause. Long enough for my chest to tighten, my lungs to lock. Click. 2 sharp notes in the darkness, deliberate as a knock at the door. I lay frozen in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, staring at the ceiling as though that thin layer of plaster could protect me. My body ached to run, to fling open the window and drop down into the wet grass outside. But I didn't move. Couldn't. Because the truth sank in like a stone dropped into a well. I'd been waiting for this. I pressed my palms over my ears, but that did nothing. The sound wasn't just in the house. It was in me. The memory of those overlapping voices, tangled like roots, hummed through my bones. "Don't open yet," I whispered to myself, a useless echo of the first warning. My voice cracked on the words. The silence that followed was worse than the clicks. Heavy, expectant. I thought of my grandmother, years of her life spent with this same silence pressing down. I thought of her hands, steady on that ledger as she wrote names she had no right to move. And I thought of her last days, the way she'd gripped my hand with paper-thin fingers and whispered about things best left locked away. Maybe she hadn't been warning me. Maybe she'd been handing me the key. The dawn light crept pale through the curtains, softening the room but doing nothing to ease the dread in my chest. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin, a cheerful good morning message. I stared at it until the screen went black. Across the hall, the house sighed. Not a rattle, not a scrape, just the long exhale of wood and air. But I knew the difference now. The coffin wasn't gone. The voices weren't gone. They were waiting. And the worst part wasn't the fear. It wasn't even the shame of inheriting my grandmother's sin. It was the quiet, gnawing certainty that sooner or later I would open it again. Because the dead don't always stay where you put them. And because sometimes neither do we.